Today, Australia's managed decline. Hi again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, well, latest post covering finance and property news. I'm pleased to say that Tarric's back for another show on a Friday afternoon. Tarric, welcome back. Fun times, huh?
Definitely, mate. There's quite a lot going on at the moment, and well, there's been some surprises and some not so surprising things. So, I mean, I don't think we've actually had a chat since everything went down with Trump and the tariffs. So there's definitely a lot to talk about.
Yeah, exactly right. Well, it's interesting how some of the international things like the tariffs and Trump filtered into the election. But actually, as we'll see, I think we get into this, a lot of the issues to do with Australia are to do with the Australian political landscape. And the big question as to where on earth are we going as a nation? Because it seems to me that we are making some really quite bad decisions or non-decisions. And I think the election will tell us quite a lot. But just briefly on the Trump, of course, Trump has, the art of the deal with Trump is to sort of take a very extreme view, push it really hard, and then pull back. That is what he does again and again. And he's done it, of course, with tariffs too. So he's pulled back. It's interesting, the UK agreement, trade agreement, on a little scrappy bit of paper with not much detail below, means that the UK will still be charged 10% for most of its things, but there's a little bit of give and take there. So you can sort of hypothesize that behind all the scenes, if they get 10% tariffs around the place, they won't be that unhappy.
No, well, I mean, I think Trump has been successful from that sort of in a vacuum, shall we say, in terms of changing the Overton window surrounding what is an acceptable tariff and what isn't. If he had have said, at the start, I only want 5 or I only want minimal tariffs, then obviously 10 or 20 or 30 might be pretty bad. But now you're seeing countries turn around and go, well, you know what, 25 or 30 really isn't too bad. So that much is definitely changed. So it's definitely going to be interesting to see how all this plays out going forward, because it's sort of come to the forefront that this is very much not just about changing the revenue sources for the US government and, trying to bring manufacturing back to the US, but it's also very much almost an economic and trade conflict with China really started to come into its own. And there's been a few little things that have flown mostly below the radar that haven't really dawned, I think, even on people in Australia who they could be impacted by, because there's a little proposal by the US Commerce Department to impose a docking fee on ships from China or made in China docking at US ports. But in the draft executive order that hit Trump's desk but hasn't been signed as of yet was that US allies should be aggressively encouraged to follow suit. Now, on, say, a giant 20,000 TEU container ship, which is 20,000 20-foot containers coming to Australia, it's going to add costs at $1.5 million US for each time a ship docks, and that's going to be fairly substantial. But if you're talking about a ship that's carrying iron ore or coal or any other form of Australian resource commodity, which have a much lower value per shipload than an entire ship full of consumer goods, all of a sudden it gets to be a whole lot more expensive for the people having those fees imposed on them. So it was going to be interesting to see how the Albanese government is going to be pulled between China and Washington as it tries to maintain a sense of neutrality.
I think that's a really important point. And, there are people who think that a lot of what's going on here is really about trying to slice up the world and get people to sort of vote pro-China, anti-China. If you're going to do a lot of deals with the US, you can't with China, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, they're meeting to talk about talks sometime over the weekend. Who initiated that? Not quite sure. What are the implications? Not quite sure. But there's a lot going on, I think, below the waterline. And I was interested, of course, that Powell this week, who left interest rates very much alone, was basically saying, well, we don't know. It could go one way, could go the other way. Until we see the data changing, we're not going to do anything on interest rates. So the question is, what is going to be the fallout? Well, nobody quite knows. And that's interesting, of course, the UK, who cut rates at the Bank of England this week. But there was a spread of votes from those who said, oh, we shouldn't be moving rates at all, through to those we should be cutting by 50 basis points, right? So there's a level of confusion out there. And I think it's because, frankly, at the heart of what the White House is doing, there is a lot of confusion there. I don't know. Is there a strategy, or is it just, bouncing from side to side to side to side to side to get somewhere roughly over there-ish?
You'd like to think that there's a strategy, but I think one of the things that's interesting is that this set of circumstances where you don't know what the tariff rates are going to be, what the trade barriers are going to be, what sort of punitive thing China could come up with, or whoever, sort of as it escalates into a more formal and traditional trade war, you just don't know. And I think Powell is right to emphasize the uncertainty. I know it's turned into a little bit of a meme and a little bit of a joke, but I don't really know what else he can realistically say. He's right, because you don't know, because Trump could, flip the chessboard over tomorrow and everything changes dramatically all over again. So I think that this is causing decision paralysis for a lot of businesses, because it's, well, do I import that shipment? I don't know. If the tariffs stay the way they are, I can't afford it. But if they change, maybe that could be different. Or even in terms of capital expenditure, in terms of business investment, am I going to build that factory in China now? Oh, I don't know. Am I going to build it in Vietnam? Well, they might be hit with tariffs too. There's the transshipment issue. So there's this real built sense of paralysis and of uncertainty building among business owners who make these decisions to drive business investment, which ultimately helps drive the private sector of economies. So if they end up stuck in this limbo for any longer than, let's call it, another 2 or 3 months, then things like recessions, perhaps not in Australia, because here we got the hammer down on government spending, but in other places, become significantly more likely.
Yes, and of course, markets took a tumble when the tariffs came out, dropped quite considerably, have climbed back up now to quite strong levels on the back. Well, maybe the tariffs won't be quite as bad. But actually, if you look at recent forward guidance from US companies, some have said, we can't tell you, we don't know quite what's going to happen. Others are still hanging to the forecast they had previously, saying, well, it's too soon to know. But with a PE ratio of 21 times on the S&P 500, which is extremely high, you've got to question whether, in fact, those markets are actually really, truly reflecting the level of risk and level of uncertainty. And, of course, the soft data, things like consumer confidence and business confidence, are significantly down. But again, Powell says, well, yeah, but that doesn't necessarily connect to the hard stuff. So we're going to wait and see what the data does. And I suppose being data dependent is interesting. But you'd have thought maybe that the Fed would have a bit of a more of a strategic view, or some different scenarios that they were thinking about, but they didn't want to talk about any of that.
Well, I think it's interesting just sort of trying to gauge exactly where we are, because if you look at, say, like US consumer confidence or forward, people how they view the future in these various, whether it's the University of Michigan or the Conference Board or whoever it is, there is a fairly clear theme that people think things are going to be horrible. No, not just bad, but downright horrible, like worse than, in some cases, worse than any time previously in the last 50 plus years. So, but the question becomes, will that be realized in any meaningful way? Because it's all well and good, because if you look at the divide on how people are viewing things by their ideological or political affiliation, Republicans think that things are going to be pretty good. Not amazing, but pretty good. You look at Democrats, they think things are going to be more awful than any other time in modern US history. And then independents are somewhere in the middle, but still pretty dour. So the question becomes, will that translate into lower levels of economic activity, and will it become a self-fulfilling prophecy? And I think there's one little just interesting tidbit, that they are now starting to collect for student loan payments again, and they are now basically making it so just the status quo is being the pre-COVID status quo is returning for student loan payments, and the number of people who haven't paid their student loans in over 12 months and therefore are in default is about 6 million Americans. Now that's going to impact those 6 million Americans' ability to spend, their families and their households' ability to spend, because they're going to start things like garnishing wages and all that sort of stuff in order to in order to basically get their money. So I think that just raises an interesting sort of question as to what's going to happen going forward for this rather sizable number of people who are generally in the prime consumer age demographic. And also another question, which I think is an interesting one for you and for the viewers, if they happen to know, is 6 million people defaulting basically within a 1 week period or 1 day period, the single largest default of consumers on a short-term basis in the history of the Western world.
It probably would be up there, wouldn't it? And of course, credit card debt is high in the US, and the number of missing payments is also up too. So there are cracks appearing at the consumer level, but again, it's not uniformly spread, and a lot of uncertainty, a lot of water to go under the bridge. But I have to say that you just sort of say, well, I can sympathise with the Fed really in saying we don't know what's going to happen. All we can do is react, and so their react function and how that works is going to be, I think, the critical question. Nobody quite knows how the story with the Trump tariffs are going to go. How many negotiations are real? The UK one was very, very superficial. When you actually look at it, there was almost no detail below, and it's going to take a long time. In UK actually also announced a deal with India, which was substantive and long and difficult. And it shows you that if you're going to do real trade negotiations, then it's going to take much, much longer. So a lot of uncertainty over there. So far as Australia is concerned, Tarric, of course, we had some white smoke this week of our own. But actually, I think that white smoke was probably to do with the brakes being pushed quite hard on one side, but also the accelerator on the other side, because we're still seeing burnout economics, aren't we, left, right and centre?
We are indeed. And I think the thing is that during this election, we saw a commitment basically from both sides to continue that particular status quo, because they're not going to stop the government spending. Both of them committed to, more handouts, more strong fiscal policy, and neither side had a plan for productivity to really drive the economy forward, to really improve things for the average Australian beyond these temporary handouts like we're going to cut your HEX by 20% or we're going to cut your fuel bill for a year or whatever it is.
We should have a little sound effect. A little sound effect. Ka-ching! Ka-ching!
Yeah, we should actually.
Right, because that actually is the the public debt going up and up. Every time they make a promise, right, we're going to actually reduce your HEX. Ka-ching! Every time, we're going to give you more support for your electricity bills. Ka-ching! It lifts the debt level. The question I was trying to get this out before the election. How is this going to work? Because we're going to basically put more and more on the never, never, wall-to-wall deficits into the future. Well, of course, the answer is we're going to put taxes up. Well, how are we going to do that? Well, we won't talk about that now, other than Dutton did just briefly. But then, of course, we've got things like the unrealized capital gains on superannuation over 3 million, which sounds like a lot of money until you realize it when it's not inflation protected. It basically means that in a few years' time, more people will pay. I mean, there's a huge gaping question here. And, we pose the question, are we in managed decline? There's nothing through the campaign that I saw that was taking a strategic view of the future, was laying out a foundation for expanding the economic base of Australia, making individuals and businesses more affluent and more able to do things. It's like we're in a weird world where managed decline seems to be the strategy.
Well, I think the thing is that with our political class, there's two separate things. There's the real economy and the world that we all live in, and that's where managed decline is okay. But if you say anything about touching the housing market, That's where they're very, very committed to growth and very, very committed to things only going in one direction. And I think that is part of the problem with Australia going forward, is that we have a political class and frankly just too many thinkers out there in the wider nation who are just committed to this idea of just no downside for the housing market. And to be completely honest with you, it's thoroughly idiotic. You look across the Tasman at New Zealand, for example. Their housing prices are down 17-18%. So in real terms, they're not too far away from where things were prior to the pandemic. And is anything on fire? Are their banks exploding? Is there mass unemployment? No, unemployment's 5.1%, and the forward-looking indicators in New Zealand are slowly turning around. Now, there's still a little bit of challenging times to go, and that's to be expected when you don't have a government like in Australia that's keeping the hammer down on government spending to prop up the economy as rate cuts work their way through. But they're creating a situation where housing is significantly more affordable. It's still not affordable, but it's going in the right direction. And if they can keep housing prices relatively flat for another, say, 5 years, they'll be in a pretty good position. But here in Australia, we've just chosen to just keep pumping the market to the moon and just damn the consequences, even though one of the reasons why we have such poor productivity and why we have such poor per capita growth is because all the cash is going into the housing market.
Yes, absolutely. And it's interesting to me that the election showed that we lost two leaders, the Greens and Dutton, but we also lost two housing spokespersons as well. And I thought that was quite an interesting observation, right? So, but the fact is that both sides of politics committed to house prices going higher. Both effectively said, well, we'll give you some more money to be able to actually buy, which means, of course, putting more pressure on house prices on the upside. And by the way, in case of the government, of course, the 5% deposit means that now they're becoming a proxy lender's mortgage insurer, which means that the state now effectively takes the risk if things go pear-shaped later. And all it's doing is just pushing those prices even more adverse to incomes. And of course, all the long-term charts show that those things have diverged because of multiple years and decades of poor government policy. It's like, we'll just pull the lever again and hope we get the same result, or I don't know. But talk to ordinary people who are in the market or trying to get into the market or renting, and you can see that the pressures on many households are just getting more and more extreme. And again, no productivity conversations through the election campaign, no real story about how we're going to grow the economy and lay a foundation for a better future. It was all about, we've got to save the housing market.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And that, I think, is just a deeply sad and concerning reflection on where we are as a nation, that we don't really have a plan for the future beyond housing price go up and population go up. And I think the simple reality is that both the major parties are stuck in this 90s, 2000s level mindset where that worked, where you look at, if you look at a growth of, say, real household disposable income per capita starting in, say, 96, 97, when housing was still very, very affordable, at least compared with where it is today, and then look at that till about the financial crisis in 2008, you go, wow, look at how well we did. Like that you saw this just explosion in living standards. But then you look into the reasons why. And you go, oh, well, it was the fact that household debt rose about fourfold relative to GDP compared with where it was. And you look at the fact that, the level of resources exports overseas, absolutely skyrocketed. So we had these two huge tailwinds at our back. And now, despite the fact that we've still got one of those tailwinds at our back at times with the resources booms, it's not feeding through the economy in the same way that it used to. So I think that we've arrived at this situation where they're committed to these strategies that once worked, but haven't actually worked for the average Australian in the street. for a very long time. But I will say that it's one of the few things actually keeping the economy afloat is the fact that this is still feeding through to older, more affluent demographics who are the only ones with any real consumption growth.
No, exactly right. And it is just worth reflecting on the election, right? Because of course Labor got in with a landslide pretty much. But if you look at the primary vote, it's in the mid-30s, which is, by the way, similar to the UK and with Starmer, who got in with a landslide. And of course, in the UK, there's no compulsory voting and there's no proportional representation or anything. But in Australia, with the transferable vote, the party with the huge majority has only 1/3 of the population directly supporting it.
I think that a lot of people are trying to take lessons away from this election on any number of issues. You know, some people said to me, "Oh, well, this is a confirmation that people want high levels of migration." No, I don't think it is. It's a confirmation that Dutton was an awful, awful, awful leader, and that they didn't have any policies. I mean, there was a recent interview just a couple of days ago with Tony Abbott with someone on YouTube, and he basically said we utterly blew it. We didn't have policies. We didn't have a policy for basically anything, and we showed that we weren't prepared to govern. And that's a direct quote from Abbott about the Liberal Party.
Yep.
So I think when you've got someone like Abbott who is saying those types of things, I think people need to, this is a strange thing to say, but take notice of what Tony Abbott is saying, because he's right. Because there was no vision, there was no nothing, and you can basically look at a graph of the coalition's polling and just go, oh, that's when Dutton opened his mouth, and then everything went wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. Christopher Pyne, of course, made a similar point on a recent interview too. And I concluded about 3 months before the election that Dutton was unelectable. And, the policies just weren't, coherent. It got worse and worse. But interestingly, of course, the consequence of that then was that the votes then moved differently in terms of the way that the preferences flow, which then, of course, caught other parties in the neck as well, didn't it?
Well, it did. I mean, I think that if we had saw a more normal election where, and I think as well, one of the things is that really sort of played into all of this is back in March, when the sort of de facto election campaign started, Dutton had a fairly commanding lead in the polls. So to people, when they actually switched on, because I think most people switch off from politics the vast majority of the time, and I totally understand that. And sometimes I wish I could do that myself, but I can't. But the thing is, a lot of people looked at that polling in March when they finally switched on, and they were paying attention in the run-up to the election, and they thought, okay, Dutton is a very, very good chance of winning here. This is what the bookies are saying. This is what the polling is saying. I really need to vote Labor if I don't want Dutton to be Prime Minister. And that's something that even people come up and said to Adam Bandt during the campaign that, look, normally I'd consider voting for you, but because there's such a serious threat of Dutton becoming Prime Minister, I can't. I need to vote Labor. So I think that's something that sort of fed into the campaign and just really benefited the Albanese government in an arguably sort of ideal way. And I don't know. I mean, I just can't help be struck with just how well a government that performed so horribly managed to do at the polls. But I guess at the end of the day, it's about the quality of the alternative, and the quality of the alternative was garbage.
Well, I've always concluded that this was very much an election where people voted against the least worst, voted for the least worst, against the horrific things that could happen, right, rather than for. So I'm not sure that it should be translated as a positive reinforcing, yes, I really want this vote for Labour. It was rather, we don't want the other guys. And, I suppose that means we are almost forced by the way the system works to vote this way. But, of course, Labour's dressing it up as, a marvellous victory, well done, Albo, great strategy, great policy, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the interesting question, Tarric, will be is to whether they execute what they said they were going to execute, or whether they say, well, we've now got this, stronger mandate, so we're going to do some different things. Are they going to tackle productivity? Probably not, although Chalmers did actually say that, first term it was about inflation. The second term, we're still going to keep an eye on inflation, but we're going to turn to productivity. So that'll be interesting to see whether they do. But the question is, of course, the settings now with high debt and ever higher debt and the ability to hand out more money for left, right, and center things, whatever you want to do, suggests that really it's a policy vacuum on their side of politics too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that if not for Dutton, and if not as well for the voice referendum going so badly for them, and then Dutton potentially being replaced by someone a little bit more palatable, I think things would have turned out quite differently because they have no vision. There's nothing beyond we want to push up housing prices and we want to fit, sort of tinker with a few things here and there. I get the feeling that Chalmers actually wants to do some fairly significant things around, say, for example, around housing, around negative gearing, and the capital gains tax discount on housing and those sorts of things. And that, gun to his head, if you said to him, do you actually want to change these things? He'd very much say yes. But the question now becomes, and people have been telling me for this for a long time, but that Labor just needs a majority. They need a strong mandate, and then they're going to change the world, and everything's going to be fantastic. And look, I'd love to be wrong. That'd be fantastic. I'd love to see them actually, like you mentioned, target productivity, fix the issues around affordable housing, have a much stronger commitment to building public housing and all those other different things. But I don't really see it. Like to be wrong, but, we'll see. Someone wants to make a bet, go for it.
Yeah, just don't hold your breath, I think is what I'd say, because I'm not sure that they are really going to do it. And, the consequence, of course, is, and I see this in my surveys, the level of pressure on households is still very, very high. And I think that the only get out of jail card potentially is the RBA cutting rates. And they probably will cut rates through the year to an extent, although probably not as fast and as hard as the markets are suggesting at the moment, not least because the inflation genie is still not completely controlled. And some of the things that are flowing through from tariffs and et cetera, could also be inflationary. But it is an interesting question about, given the majority that they've got in the lower house, given the fact that the upper house is going to basically comprise now of them, I think it's 11 Greens and however many from the Conservative side. So there's going to be an easier upper house. But the question is, will they then push the more if you like, left-leaning policies through the upper house to try and get the Greens to support them, or will they swing more to the right to try and get the Conservative side of politics to support them in the upper house? That'll be a really interesting tussle.
It is going to be an interesting thing because they literally don't need anyone else in this instance. They literally can just work with the Greens. And I mean, if you see, I was looking at, I think there's 5 Senate seats still in doubt, and in 3 of them, Labor are ahead. So if we assume, for the sake of argument, that Labor get those seats, then they only need six other votes in the Senate to pass legislation. And they could get them from any number of, they could get it from Jackie Lambie or Tammy Tyrell or David Pocock or any number of other people. So there is increasingly a pathway in which they don't have to potentially do business with the Greens if they win those seats, that is. If they don't, well, then they really better get accustomed to dealing with the Greens in the Senate, because otherwise they're not going to get anything done.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you did put some slides together, and we've already had a good wheel, but maybe we should look at some of the slides, Tarric, not least because there's some really powerful stuff that you've got there. And I got to start with this, right? So looking at the the ruby slippers are made in China. I thought that was a lovely, lovely, lovely cartoon.
Yeah, I thought the viewers would enjoy that. As usual, the charts can be found at burnout-economics.com. I'm quite bad at self-promotion, so if you would like to become a paid subscriber at burnout-economics.com, that would be very much appreciated, or make a one-off contribution. You can do it at the link below. Also, I recently started up, I know a lot of you potentially aren't on Twitter, but if you are on Facebook, I also sent Martin a link for the Burnout Economics Facebook page. It's mostly just charts and that sort of thing. So if that's what interests you, please follow. That would be very much appreciated. So we'll get into the charts. Now, before the election, I put together this chart that shows how much it normally swings, how much the two-party preferred vote normally swings away from governments. And the answer is it varies, but in every post-World War II election, there was a swing away from the sitting government. Sorry, every first term government since World War II. Yet this election saw a swing to the government. I think that just really illustrates just how badly Dutton managed to screw this up. Because even if he had the sort of Menzies primo ideal swing against the government of only 0.3%, okay, that wouldn't have been great, but it's something. And I think as well that a result in that range wouldn't have delivered the gains that Labor made against the Greens and everyone else, which very much strengthened their hand.
Yeah, well, we said, Dutton failed miserably, right? And I'm not sure he was ever really up to it, but certainly with the poor polling information he got, it sounds as though some of the polls, they didn't bother to poll in certain areas of the country because they didn't think it was worth it. And of course, they lost huge support in the inner suburban areas. A few years ago, a lot of those would have been Howard supporters. And of course, the thing about Howard was he had a very broad base of support. But my perspective is that Dutton support got narrower and narrower and narrower. It wasn't so much a broad church as a very sharp pinnacle.
It is, and I think that there's a lot of reasons why that's happening. Now, there's obviously the reason that Dutton is a bad leader, and the people who managed his campaign are idiots. But I think it goes beyond that, because Australia's demographics are changing, and I don't just mean that in the sense of migration, although that is potentially a factor. That's something that Kos Samaras from Redbridge posted on Twitter a while ago, that basically newly arrived migrants are about 20% more likely to vote for Labor, according to an academic study that he shared on Twitter. Now, but there's also the fact that, and this is something that we're going to get to later on in the slides, but since we're discussing it now, renters vote Labor in two-party preferred terms by almost 2-1 over the coalition. So by pursuing a strategy of high levels of migration and a strategy of ever higher housing prices, which creates more and more renters and more stunted household formation, the coalition has basically committed long-term electoral demographic suicide. And unless it can really get back to its roots, or Labor makes an absolute mess of things, it's going to find it very, very, very hard to get back into a position where it can govern in its own right.
Absolutely. Well, and of course, through the campaign, you upset civil servants because you're going to, chop out jobs in the civil servants. You upset those people who work from home. You upset those who perhaps are women. So who are you actually cheering for? It was like you're chopping off a limb here. What's left? I mean, there's almost nothing left in the carcass.
Well, I think that's the thing as well, is that it was so much of it was just negative. It was, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, this is going to impact this group, this is going to impact that group. But there was so little about how much is this actually going to impact people positively. And, this is something that I think that one of the Liberal strategists, former Liberal strategist who now works at Redbridge Polling, mentioned on the ABC on election night. He said, all of this stuff that they're talking about is temporary. If there's a temporary tax offset, there's a temporary cut to fuel excise, there's a temporary cut to migration. It's all very, this is one of the situations where I can actually use the forbidden central bank word, transitory.
Hey.
So there was just nothing there in terms of a long-term vision from the Liberal Party that was actually going to improve things, aside from we might have nuclear power 30, 40 years from now. So I think there was just nothing there for people, and they just responded accordingly. And honestly, I think that it's a little bit of a joke that the Liberal Party didn't see this a bit earlier and change tack. But there was a thing recently I think it was in the AFR, saying that they were putting a modifier as a result of the voice referendum into the polls, which made them look better. And I'm just like, you people are idiots. I mean, no referendum in Australian history has ever succeeded without bipartisan support. So just why would you do that? You'd have to be a complete idiot, or like, I mean, some people have said that that they're plants, that there's people in there working against the Liberal Party, but maybe there are. I mean, maybe that's the rational explanation, not that they're all just idiots.
Or maybe they really didn't want to get elected because it was going to be very hard ahead.
Well, I mean, if you were going to do that, you'd sort of be a little bit less crap, like, okay, I don't want to get elected, but let's take a few seats off Labor here and there. Let's run like a sort of moderately competent campaign, and give ourselves a real shot next time, rather than, oh crap, we just lost like most of our urban seats.
And just a quick comment, of course, the future leadership of the ex-Dutton is a big problem, isn't it, really?
Yes. I mean, the problem is that the talent pool of the Liberal Party is just... Let me put it this way. It's appropriate for preschoolers to go swimming in. Because it's so shallow that there's no threat of them, no serious threat of a supervised group of preschoolers drowning, and I think that's really the problem going forward. You've got Susan Ley, who famously bought a apartment in Queensland on a taxpayer funded trip on a whim from a Liberal donor, and then there's Angus Taylor. Great job, Angus. Bonus points in the comments if you get that reference. And he is just he is basically Josh Frydenberg to Peter Dutton, Scott Morrison. He was there, right? He was there, the number two man, making the decisions on the campaign, and there's no vision whatsoever. And just on a personal note, I'm actually a big fan of Robert Menzies. At a conceptual level, I think he had a lot of great ideas. And he delivered on those ideas about, people having a stake in society and higher home ownership rates. And he delivered on that. And in that process, he gave property investors the finger. The proportion of properties owned by property investors in Australia during that period more than halved while he was PM for that second duration between 49 and 66, between 48 or 49 and 66. And he did a lot of great stuff. And he is literally the man who created the Liberal Party. He literally wrote, the party's seminal text, The Forgotten People. I think the Liberal Party members should read it. They might get some ideas.
Well, exactly. Well, they're going to go one of two ways, aren't they? They're going to completely wither, or they're going to have to actually do a major reset, Alt Delete, Control, Alt Delete, and try and find something new. But the fundamental philosophical basis for what they stand for is in question, in my view.
Well, I think the problem is they don't actually stand for anything.
Right.
They stand for, big business. They stand for higher housing prices, and then there really isn't that much else. I mean, like if you go out, I think, and you talk to people at a polling place, or if you run a survey and you ask people what do the Liberal Party stand for, you'll get a few rusted-ons talking about things like economic management or national defence or all that sort of thing. But I think for the sort of average person, the sort of median person, someone who's sort of, their late 30s, early 40s, who's, the statistical median, I don't think that a lot of people in that demographic are really going to know what they stand for, because they don't really talk about it. I mean, you look at someone like Tony Abbott. I was watching that interview with him talk, sort of dissecting their failure, but even someone who no longer has a stake in all of this couldn't bring himself to talk about, he talked about Menzies, he talked about Fraser, he talked about these things, but he didn't mention Fraser, because Fraser doesn't like him very much, but he didn't actually get to the core of what the Liberal Party is. And I think that's just emblematic of just how far they've fallen from what they could be, and frankly what they should be.
Absolutely. And of course, the demographics that you touched on, and we'll touch on again shortly, is quite significant, right? Because we have a high proportion of people in the rental sector. We have a larger numbers now of younger Australians rather than the baby boomer plus generation. So there are some fundamental shifts going on in terms of the basic construction of the way that society is working, and of course the distribution across different states and territories and different electorates too, which is quite interesting. I mean, Bant said, well, they redefined the centre of Melbourne, and I lost quite a lot of support because of it. It's an interesting observation there about the fact that the boundaries changed, etc., etc. So there's a lot of noise there, but from the Conservative side of politics, I have no idea what they stand for. I don't think they know what they stand for. I don't know that they actually nearly know who they're trying to talk to. And so unless there's a fundamental shift, I don't know where they go.
No, I thoroughly agree. We should probably get on to the next slider. Okay, now, as I mentioned, every first-term government post-World War II saw a swing against them. Now, since the fact that the size of the lower house has changed over time, I've adjusted that into modern terms. And as you can see, every single first-term government post-World War II has lost seats at the subsequent election, except Albo, who has gained the average over the last 30 years, except in the complete opposite direction. So I think this is just another sort of illustration of just the scale of failure. It's literally the worst first-term opposition since at least World War II, and probably in all of Australian history, to be honest.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's fundamentally broken, isn't it? And what it also probably means is that Albo is probably going to stand, or at least the Labor Party could stand to win next time too.
Well, I think the thing is this was pretty ideal set of circumstances for the Liberal Party. Inflation was a major issue that wasn't addressed. The government got the absolute hammer down on migration to a record level, which annoyed a lot of people. We saw the largest fall in living standards since records began almost 50 years ago. And I mean, realistically, for an opposition, what more can you ask for? And not only that, but then they spent the best part of a year screwing around with the whole voice referendum, which ended up getting absolutely smoked. So, I mean, you couldn't, as an opposition leader, you couldn't ask for a weaker first-term government to be up against. Yet they found a way to completely and utterly screw it up. And, I mean, I can't help but see parallels with the Victorian Liberal Party of just the inexplicable ability to just fail and then fail some more, even when the situation should be turning in your favor, even when the gods have smiled upon you, they still find a way to screw it up.
Yes, they do seem to know how to do that. That's probably their secret power, isn't it?
Yes, they literally have the worst superpower, and I guess in a lot of ways in a lot of ways I feel like they almost deserve it, like they've been cursed by like a witch. It's like you must return, unless you return to your party's genuine underlying foundational ideology, you're going to keep having bad leaders who make crap decisions. And I think the funny thing is that that's actually been true in a lot of ways since the end of the Howard government. Because the only reason that the Liberals were competitive in a lot of ways post-Howard was just what would you call it? The utter stupidity of elements of the Labor Party. Because you had the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd saga, which pretty much sort of covers itself. But then there was also the 2019 election, which they also made a complete hash of, even though there were people within the Labor Party telling them, you're going too far, you're going too fast, slow down, focus on a few key issues, get your mandate, then, figure things out. But they didn't listen. Someone's going to write a book about that eventually. It's going to be a real page turner.
Yeah, and just briefly on the Howard Costello era, just to remind everybody, they sort of had a broader base because they were handing out money left, right, and centre, right, through tax cuts. And the reason they could do that was because we had, the resources boom, and they were swimming in money, and were just handing out left, right, and centre. So there was no real deep policy, even in the Howard Costello era.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to annoy a lot of people by saying this probably, but here we go. I don't think that the Howard government was anywhere near as great or as economically competent as it's made out. Like you look at the sale of the assets. Okay, the CBA was on its way out the door with Keating, but you look at, say, like selling the airports, for example. Like some of those. I mean, even if you adjust for inflation, and the gains that have been made, on not having that debt over the last, call it 25 or 30 years, it's still not a great trade.
No.
And not only that, but to be honest, selling monopoly government services and infrastructure just doesn't really make any sense, to be honest with you, because eventually someone just ends up just jacking up the prices, and then you end up like Sydney, and there's the most tolled city on the planet.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I would argue that policy failure was there at the heart of the Howard Costello government too. And the fact is that we've had a whole chapter of accidents where the other side of politics have just been so weak that people have been able to get away with murder and make promises that just don't make any sense at all. So where is the beef in terms of actually, the economic strategy, the future of the country, all of those things? None of that actually exists, and that's the problem. So we're in this sort of managed decline is what we call the show, and I think that's it. We like it or not, we're heading in the wrong direction.
Well, I will say one thing for the Liberal Party: maybe Albo will implode. Maybe you're already seeing a little bit of that with Dreyfus and Husek being taken off the front bench for factional reasons. So, hey, I mean, it's not unprecedented. Abbott made a complete mess of his landslide. Rudd and Gillard made a complete mess of theirs. So, to be fair, it's about on par for the last 20 years of Aussie politics.
Yeah, it could well be. Now, we just touched on the renters earlier, but it's worth us looking at that data in a bit more detail, isn't it? Because it's really quite fascinating just to see what the implications of this are.
Yeah, well, it's going to be interesting going forward, because you are seeing this basically 2/3 split going towards Labor. Now, this is taken from the Australian, and I've just remade the graph because the other one was awful. And I just think it's fascinating as well to just, and there's also just another side to this that I think is interesting. I recently did an article. I'll get you to link it in the description. I'll send you the link when we finish. And basically what I did is I went through and I tried to determine what the rate of household formation was for the 25 to 34 demographic. And what I found was that basically households are forming at a much, much lower rate than they were back in, say, 2003, 2004. So there are about 300,000 households of the 25 to 34 variety that don't exist. Now, these are people who live in share houses. These are people who live in multi-generational households. And these are people who, or even they're still living at home. So you're seeing not only this demographic factor on your screen, which is the shift towards renters, but you're seeing also this shift towards people who never had a sustainable chance to become an independent household to begin with. And that's a dangerous thing, both from an electoral perspective for the Liberal Party, because they're going to be the ones who are going to cop it the most, but also from a social perspective, because stunted households and stunted people who haven't been able to press on in life the way that they would like is never a recipe for a good thing.
No. Well, we've discussed before the fact that first-time buyers are getting into the market a lot later. Household formation is a lot later. Birth rates are way down. There are signals in those numbers which highlight the economic malaise. If people had more income, were actually feeling more affluent, they would be doing things a lot earlier, but they can't. So the barriers for household formation, buying a property, or even renting. And again, the old 30% of income, which is trotted out as being a barrier. Well, now on those 36, 46, 56% of income going on housing, that is policy failure writ large.
It is, and I think that this is just. I think it's just worth taking a step back a moment and looking at all this as part of the broader issue. And I think that this just really illustrates just how utterly, utterly unsustainable the status quo is. People say to me, well, we need to do things gradually. We need to, have housing prices stagnate and for wages to rise. And then, in 10 or 15 years, we'll sort of have things under better control. Now, one, that's not going to happen because it's unrealistic, because you can't stop the team red and team blue from pumping housing prices. It's an addiction for them.
Yeah.
But more than that, we don't have time. We don't have 10 or 15 years to deal with another round of stunted generational household formation, to deal with another round of people going into another round of people setting themselves up to go into retirement carrying mortgage debt. We don't have the time to be able to keep seeing household consumption per capita or household disposable income per capita continue to go down, to continue to basically go either nowhere, or when you actually adjust for taking, the affluent boomers out of the equation, going backwards. We can't have another 10 or 15 years of that. It's going to completely undermine the country. It's going to undermine our society, and in time, it's going to. And you can take this to the bank if things stay this way. In time, it will drive political and social extremism. It is a simple fact.
Absolutely. Well, I've said for some time that it's the social consequences as well as the just pure economics, right? And we're seeing that already. If you look in some of the high stressed areas, crime rates are continuing to rise because people just have no way of living with what's going on at the moment. And what I find worrying about this is that if you talk to the law enforcement agencies, they recognize this. They recognize that a lot of crime is directly linked to impoverishment, directly linked to the fact that people just don't have the money to get by. And then, of course, you've got the next level, which is those people who are not spending money on healthcare and dentistry and those things that actually are quite important in terms of long-term survival and long-term good health. So we end up with effectively a society which is financially poorer, but also socially poorer, economically poorer, and very importantly, the community values just get crushed in the process. That's not an Australia that I think people should want to see or expect to see.
No, and I think the funny thing is just how quiet elements of our political leadership and the institutions around them are about these things. There was a report recently, I think it was last year or the start of this year, by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which is basically the name for their cop shop, and they talked about the impact of the current status quo in Canada and how it was going to drive the rise of extremism, the rise of crime, and a lot of those issues, which in Canada they are already seeing, and we are, as you mentioned, seeing those in those areas as well. And it's ridiculous, the fact that we aren't moving to address these issues and instead have our entire major party political apparatus turn around and say, you know what? We're going to make all of this worse.
Absolutely. And it's just worth re-emphasizing again, isn't it, that some household consumption and household growth is going completely the wrong direction.
Yep. And that takes us to our next slide. It does. Now, this is the average annual rate based on the 10-year rolling average of household consumption growth per capita. And as you can see, it's basically heading towards flatlining. And if you strip out the wealthier boomer end of things, it would be deeply, deeply negative. So, yeah, we are at a situation where the average Australian is very much going backwards. Now, naturally, as people progress through their lives, they as individuals will hopefully see better outcomes. but at an average aggregate level, they are seeing worse outcomes than people that age were previously. So it's it's a very, very problematic set of circumstances, and one that is in desperate, desperate need of addressing. But I don't think anyone at all within the major parties even touched on this
No.
during the election campaign.
No, well, I was disappointed that nobody actually wanted to talk about it. And of course, the data shows that on OECD data, for example, that this is worse in Australia relative to a lot of other Western countries. So in other words, we in Australia, despite all the mineral resources boom that we've had, have actually done a whole lot worse.
I think, yeah, 100%. And I think that that's something that sort of, I feel like that almost needs to be a banner on at the front of Parliament House. We are doing worse than other people without, this enormous resources bounty. I mean, realistically, we should be one of the most wealthy, productive nations on Earth.
Yep.
But instead, we've gone, well, you know what? Let's completely flip the ratio of credit going to housing and credit going to businesses, and just plow it all into a giant property bubble, and then plow even more into it, and just keep doing that until it all ends badly.
Plus, of course, paying through the nose for gas and not actually taxing export gas. That is a crime of its own, in my view.
Oh, there's a lot. I mean, I think we could get into all the various missteps and crimes by the the Australian government against its people, but I think we would need to turn this into a 3-part miniseries.
You probably would. But going back to the other issue, the affordability question, right? So, my data is showing that affordability is shot for those trying to get into the housing, whether it's renting or whether it's actually with a mortgage. And it's got worse and worse and worse.
Yeah, indeed. That brings us to our next chart. Now, I actually got quite a bit of traction when I wrote a tweet on this recently, and it actually got picked up and had an article made into it by the ABC, which was interesting. And what it basically shows is, okay, let's start with the scenario. The scenario that underpins this is the idea that at what point, if housing prices grew at 2% and wages grew at 3%, would the median house be affordable for the median household in a given place? Now, I've tried to give this the best possible chance to succeed. Instead of the normal 30% figure that Martin previously mentioned, I've raised it to 35. And I've also unilaterally cut mortgage rates to 4.75%, and I am keeping them there forever. Now, if we were to magically see this set of circumstances realized, and it would be 2096 in Sydney before the median Sydney household could afford the median Sydney house, which is basically roughly how it was in the very late 1990s. So, yeah, it's quite the mess. And if anyone's wondering why it's no longer 2111, it's because I adjusted the household income for the Sydney household income. I also was a little bit more generous I was actually very generous with the level of growth that it's seen since the last census. So yes, I tried to give this the best possible chance to succeed, even though the result is somewhat comical, and the year that Sydney housing becomes affordable sounds something more akin to science fiction.
Oh, well, on current settings, it will never be affordable, and it just means that there will be less and less people who can buy, which, of course, has its own profound implications. And, of course, with high migration, there will still be some people coming into the country with wealth that they bring in, particularly with exchange rates where they are, which allows them to buy. But what it means is that many ordinary Australians are facing a future where they will never own a property, ever.
No, and that's part of the social problems going forward, because Australia is not engineered for people to retire without a property of their own. We do not have the social housing for that. We do not, I mean, I think and there's something just just quick note on that. There's this idea that, it's young single mums and all that who are the largest demographic in social and public housing. It's not. It's actually people over the age of 50. And we do not have the social housing for the people who need it for a start. And we certainly don't have it for all of these people who are, 50, 55 plus, who don't own homes, who are renting, who do have some super, but in time, a lot of these people are going to be reliant on the state to put a roof over their heads. And that is an absolute time bomb of an issue. And that, once again, it's not being addressed. And, we're going down a path where we're seeing the concentration of wealth and the concentration of shelter, for God's sake, in an increasingly narrow set of people. And I think another thing as well is that if there are people who are trapped, who have gotten into the housing market, who have bought an apartment, who have tried their very best to move up into a house, into a freestanding house, to avoid the strata, to avoid all these other issues that come with apartment living, who haven't managed to make it work, understandably so, considering how much harder that is now than it has been historically. These people as well are going to face issues because the aged pension is not enormous. I mean, okay, it's fairly hefty, but if you're in a situation where you've got an average amount of super and you've got to pay strata fees and, you've got to pay for, remediation works as your building ages and, because unfortunately too many buildings are, as Edwin would term it, Opal Tower 2.0. It's just not, it's just not viable long term. So you're going to end up with more and more people in precarious situations as they age. And I mean, it's just a mess.
Yeah, and just to add to the mess, the build to rent sector, which of course the government is trying to encourage, and they've given some tax breaks, they will be building for rent, but they won't be providing rental accommodation for the bulk of ordinary Australians. They're going to charge a lot more because they will need to make a return and will actually build more flashy types of apartments. So it's not actually going to help.
I hate the settings of this country in that regard, because we have an issue where we have screwed ourselves as a nation, because if rental yields were higher, you get more supply. Like you look at, say, a place like Austin in Texas, for example, right? You saw a surge in rents and then a cascade of supply, which is then pushed down rents, because that's the way a normal market works. Because in a normal real estate market, people go, what does the yield like? Is it worth me buying this property? Well, the yield is garbage. I'm losing money. I'm not going to buy it. Yet in Australia, people turn around and go, well, I'm just going to negatively gear it. I'm beating the tax man. How great is that? And that leads to this retarded situation whereby the normal laws of supply for the property market no longer apply. Because, I mean, here's an interesting one. Let's just take a factual example rather than what some people may term hyperbole. Back in the mid-'80s, which someone in academia, I forget who it was, but they kindly gave me the data on what proportion of investor lending was going where. Almost 2/3 back in the 80s was going to building new properties because the yields were good, because the quality of a property matters to its yields. And because we were building good quality properties, you got a good quality rent, which everybody wins. Property investors build homes. The level of property investor ownership overall remains static, but because they're growing their nominal number through largely through new builds, and that adds to supply, which helps with rental affordability. And because rental yields were still very good, they did very well for themselves as well. So at a lower level of price settings for housing prices, everybody wins, even the property investors.
Funny that. We've highlighted, I think, how broken it is. Now, just before we come to the end of the show, Tarric, you've got a couple of slides relating to the US and trade, and it's just worth reflecting on that. Just to highlight, do you remember the old black and white film called On the Beach? It was actually based on a nuclear explosion in the northern hemisphere. And it was sort of, this contamination was sort of creeping around the world, right? And people were in Australia, were in, furthest away, so they were least affected. That's what I feel a bit with what's happened with the trade imposition on China, right? Something has happened to trade, and it's slowly creeping towards the US, and the impact is going to be highly profound.
Indeed. Interesting side note, that was actually filmed in my house.
Oh.
Now, this is, I think, a nice illustration of just how much trade is being impacted. You're seeing a collapse. The largest collapse is US exports to China, which have dropped by over 75% compared with where they were in March. Now, don't get me wrong, part of that is seasonality, but the drop is still enormous. Now, the level of trade coming from China to the US has also dropped dramatically. My apologies. And yeah, basically it's not looking too good. And Australia is very much in the middle of this because the US is our security guarantor and our closest ally, and China is our number one export customer by far.
Absolutely. And the point is, the thing I wanted to try and underscore, this takes time to work through, right? It percolates through the system. So we haven't yet seen the full impact, but you can see on the horizon that, the lack of trade, the implications, shortages, all of those things, and the complex interaction of all these things will ultimately hit Australia too.
It will, and I think the thing as well is we're also going to see the economic impact too. We're going to see not only the impact through trade flows, but just through how China and the US will struggle if this status quo continues. You can't just cut off trade between the two, not just cut off, but you can't dramatically reduce trade between the two largest economic powers on the planet, who are extremely reliant on each other in an almost symbiotic way by over half, and not expect problems. But you are absolutely correct that this is a slow burn issue. This isn't something that's going to just blow up tomorrow. You're going to start to see small businesses having shortages in the US in the coming months. And then later in the year, it'll be, you'll start to see Walmart not have enough Barbie dolls or whatever it may be. And that is just going to slowly feed through the system. And I think that is an issue for markets which are pricing in. Well, let me put it this way: markets are pretty much where they were before Trump opened his mouth.
Yep.
So it's. I don't think a continued faster clock of an issue is going to be priced in anytime soon. And I think in a lot of ways, it's a little bit like when you and I sat down and we were talking about COVID in January and very early February of 2020, except instead of this time where everything played out very, very quickly, and it was very obvious relatively quickly how challenging it was going to get, I think this is going to happen very slowly. I think you're going to start to see a lot of deniers saying, oh, everything's fine. Everything's great. I think we're seeing that to a fairly significant degree, particularly on China, where everyone's like, well, yeah, no, but China's going to be fine. I mean, look at the strength of the yuan recently against the US dollar. I think that's a major issue that we're going to see going forward. And it's all well and good for people to say, well, think of the empty factories and the empty shelves in Walmart come Christmas. But if the shelves in Walmart are empty, the factories in China who make the stuff for Walmart are going to be empty even sooner.
Absolutely. Well, Trump said, you might only have $2 rather than $30, right? And you might only have 5 pencils rather than 200. I mean, silly examples, but consequential.
That's a pretty big drop in the doll ratio. I mean, that's historic.
Exactly right. Oh, and by the way, it's about what 25% of global GDP is export. Is that right?
Yes,
exported
yes,
goods? Yeah.
yes. It's around. I think it's actually a little bit higher than this, because this is a little bit. This chart's a little bit old, but yes, it's around about 25% of GDP. And people said during the 90s and 2000s that free trade stops wars. Free trade is blah blah blah, is beneficial, is interconnectedness is going to prevent all these horrible things from happening. That was one of the plot lines on the West Wing that always annoyed me, to be completely honest with you. But you can see here that there's what the historian Neil Ferguson calls the first age of globalization, which came to a rather abrupt halt following the First World War. Because here's a little interesting factoid. Currently, trade from China to the US represents 13% of US trade. Trade between Germany and Britain in 1913 was 13% of British trade. And I just think it's funny that people think that interconnectedness is going to prevent wars and conflict and issues, when if you look at the chart, it shows that exactly when things were the most interconnected they'd ever been up until that point was when we really went to town on each other and things got very, very challenging. And I think it's just worth emphasizing that challenging domestic conditions economically drive political extremism.
Yeah.
And they drive geopolitical uncertainty. And it's that uncertainty and that vagueness in a lot of ways about geopolitics that can lead to wars and conflicts and all different things occurring, whether they be trade related or whether they be, kinetic. Just because, not everything that happens in the world happens because someone intended it to happen. Things happen because things snowball, because, one thing leads to another, to another, to another, and then things get ugly. And I think that's just something worth keeping in mind going forward.
Well, there's talk here about what's called the war dividend. In other words, because we're going to spend more on defense, that actually is going to be good economically for the UK, for example, which I find horrendous to think about. And how anybody can think that war is in any way positive for individuals, communities, or economies just doesn't make any sense at all to me. I mean, war is destructive. War is not economically positive, other than if you're in the defense industry or something like that, right? But the talk is just wild. It
is, and I think that a lot of people are still stuck in, I'm going to call it 1937. I think people are stuck in this idea, or even let's just call it, World War II in general. Like I was reading some of the commentary from Germany, because they're going to dramatically increase defense spending, or they claim they will. They won't, but they claim they will. And, there's all these people saying, well, this is going to benefit the German economy so much. This is going to be huge. This is going to be X, Y, and Z. And it's just a load of bollocks, to be honest. And I mean, I don't really use that word that often, so I think that emphasizes how just unserious it is. I mean, like, when you've got this giant military-industrial complex producing everything from, the humble Jeep radio all the way up to, a Pershing tank, then yeah, sure, because you're employing just millions upon millions of people and a huge proportion of the labor force. But if you look at the size of the defense sector in Germany in terms of the number of people actually employed there, not how much it costs, but the actual people involved, it's actually very, very, very small. It's minuscule compared with what it was, 80 years ago. So this idea that there's going to be this huge dividend from spending on defense, well, not really. I mean, and not only that, but just not to go off on too much of a tangent, but I mean, say here in Australia, we overspend on our procurement something rotten.
Yes.
Like things like fighter jets, we do okay with, but because we're basically just buying them at sticker. But if you look at some of our warships and then you compare how much say, for example, because our two largest warships, the Hobart class destroyers and the Canberra class helicopter docks, if you compare them to their Spanish prices and adjust for inflation, oh boy, you're going to be pissed.
Absolutely. And of course, it's got the old AUKUS spending in the background around, which is an interesting set of spending if you think about the relationship between the US and all of the issues there, and when and if and how, and how much are we spending on that? I mean, to my mind, we could be spending quite a lot more on more important things than on the never on the defense track that doesn't make a lot of sense.
Look, I mean, I understand that the people are concerned and they want to be prepared for a world where things aren't the way that they've been over the last, say, 30 years, and I get that. But I'm not sure that spending $360 billion, or probably more now because of inflation, that has occurred since, is on, a relative handful of submarines is the way to go about it. But, at the end of the day, I don't actually see any real change to that happening. No. Because, frankly, it's at this point, AUKUS is a bargaining chip with the US.
Yep.
It's something that says, we're playing ball with you. So if we turn around and say no, I think that's going to end quite badly for us diplomatically.
I agree. Well, we're sort of caught in that crosshair between China on one hand and US on the other. Now, there's one other slide which I just want to get to before we close out. I know we've been going on a bit, but this is a really fascinating one and a really important object lesson, Tarric.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, because people have talked a lot about the impact of negative gearing over the years, over what impact does it have on investor demand. Now, this is something that's fascinated me for a long time. And New Zealand, because they actually started phasing out negative gearing, and then with the election of the Luxon government was then confirmed that it would be coming back, we actually now have a data point on what things look like with negative gearing and without negative gearing. Now, as you can see, the blue line is pre-negative gearing, and the orange line is when it was known that negative gearing would be making a return. And as you can see, it surges dramatically. So, and apologies for anyone who's listening to this as a podcast. The chart is of the annual number of new investor mortgages in New Zealand, and the number has risen, by about 60% from its lows, and by over 50% from where it was before negative gearing was reintroduced. So I think this shows fairly substantially that there is at least some relationship between negative gearing and investor demand for properties.
Funny that, which of course is an important object lesson given the recent debates about negative gearing in Australia and why is it that the housing market has gone where it's gone, and all those things. Tarric, we've covered the ground very well, I think, but the bottom line to my mind as I think about all of this is there are policy decisions that should be being taken and could be being taken that would make a significant difference to where Australia is heading. Unfortunately, the last election shows us that we're actually in this managed decline and there's no real appetite to change direction. And meantime, the broader economic context that we're working within is also taking us in the same direction. So it looks as though it's going to be an uncomfortable ride over the next few years.
Yeah, probably, but at least it'll be entertaining.
Well, I hope it will be entertainment, and I hope that we'll be able to come back and have another chat down the track. Tarric, always appreciate your time and your charts. And we've put links and things below, so people should check those out and sign up and support Tarric as well. He does some great work and massive insight coming through on Twitter and all the other channels too. Tarric, thank you so much. Great to catch up with you again. And we'll look forward to the next time. Now, I'm sure there'll be something else to talk about with then.
Well, definitely, mate. Thanks for having me.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye, mate.